Hey my friends, it's really good to see you again. We're going to be walking here at what's called the circuito. It's the Circuit Freeway. It's just a little freeway that just bolts through Mexico City. I don't know exactly when it was built, but there's only about, I think, 2 or 3 major freeways in Mexico City that we would call freeways from North America. There's the Periférico, the Circuit, and I think it's called the Viaducto. And these 3 kind of allow drivers to get to the other side or north-south of the city, or go all the way around the city. We're walking to a cemetery. It's historically connected to the invasion of Mexico by the North Americans. It is some land that the Americans purchased after their invasion to bury the soldiers that were unknown after the war. So after a battle, the armies bury their dead, and sometimes over the time, the rain, you don't know who they are anymore. And so they purchased this little plot of land so that they could bury their unknown soldiers, as well as have a place for administrators and other government officials from the United States that were living here in Mexico City at the time. The cemetery used to be bigger. It used to go out into where now the Circuit Freeway is. But at some point, Mexico bought back some of the property, and the cemetery was made a little bit smaller when the Circuit was built. The first time that I found the U.S. National Cemetery, it was by mistake. It's owned by the American Battle Monuments Commission, who do a beautiful job of creating a space to honor the dead from the Mexican-American War and wars from around the world. I think cemeteries like Normandy and other cemeteries that honor the dead in foreign lands are kept up by the same commission. I find this spot here to be great for meditation, thinking. There was once a Buddhist monk who would sit by the stream and he would listen to the sound of water, and because it helped him meditate on how everything in life is passing by. I think that looking at these tombs, graves, is important. Each one of these was a life. Many of them are trying their best to do what they thought was right. The invasion of Mexico is a deeply controversial, and for many it was an unjust war. It's important to remember that they were still people. It's interesting to look at all these American names and to think about the sacrifices that not only the soldiers made, but the people who serve the United States and any country that they're part of, but serve it outside of their own country. And there, many of these people may have also been government officials who tried to put the pieces back together after the invasion of Mexico. It's an interesting fact that the military of the United States in 1846 was 50% immigrants, mostly from Germany, Italy, and parts of, I think, Western Europe. The United States offered citizenship to many people who volunteered to go to war with Mexico. This is actually a practice that we still use today. Many Mexican Americans or Mexicans who immigrate to the United States, both legally or illegally, often can fight for their citizenship. One controversial thing that has occurred in the United States recently is that many people who fought for the United States were later on deported. The graves used to be here in the center part. When Mexico bought back part of the property to build the freeway outside, the bodies were moved and re-entombed or buried in these side panels here in the walls. I think in American history, it could be argued that there was no more important war, possibly World War II, but there was no more important war that defined what the American nation would be after this war. it could be argued, or at least maybe it should be included, that if the war was not our best natured war, one that did violate our own principles, it still is a magnificently important war. And these soldiers, these people, they played a part in building what is the United States. There is no way to even conceive what we would be without the acquisition of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Las Vegas, or California. And on the simple level of a soldier, they gave their lives, they sacrificed the peacefulness to go into violence. And even if it was a war that many people disagree with, it was something that built the United States in a way that no other war did. But there were definitely critics at that time, and I think that as Americans we should respectfully look back at this war, and we should not only respect the bravery of the troops, but we should think about how people like Ulysses S. Grant, who served in this war, later on in his life, he did think that it was unjust. People like Abraham Lincoln felt that this was unconstitutional. Private John H. Smith, E-934 F Troop, 9th U.S. Cavalry, from 1872 to 1877, born North Carolina. The Buffalo Soldiers. Buffalo Soldiers were African American soldiers who mainly served on the western frontier following the American Civil War. In 1866, 6 all-black cavalry and infantry regiments were created after Congress passed the Army Organization Act. Their main tasks were to help control the Native Americans of the plains, capture cattle rustlers, and thieves, and protect settlers, stagecoaches, wagon trains, and railroad crews along the Western Front. Private Smith served with the 9th U.S. Cavalry from 1872 to 1877 in Texas and New Mexico. The 9th U.S. Cavalry was one of several African American cavalry in the United States during this time. These African American units served honorably during this time by protecting travelers in Indian territories, escorting the mail, and scouting for hostile natives. During the time of Private Smith's service, F Troop of the 9th U.S. Cavalry served in Texas and battled intermittently with the Apaches, Kiowas, and Comanches. In 1875, the 9th moved to New Mexico and participated in the Apache Wars. We're not sure why he moved to Mexico. A lot of the records for people who came after the war are sparse. Some worked in government. I had to wonder to myself was there a level of leaving the United States for Mexico as an African American who had served his country, and with racism still existing, we have a record of a lot of African Americans deciding to leave. I mean, I'm somebody who's European American, and Mexico appeals to me for its freedom, for its beauty, for its ability to trust one another and to serve one another. I had to wonder if maybe that had something to do with it, but I don't want to put words in the mouth of someone who can't speak for himself. I only wanted to show him respect. I was watching a documentary on some of the history of the Mexican-American War, and one person called it the war that Americans can't remember and the war that Mexicans can't forget. For the Mexican nation, it was clearly a violation of world treaties, and it was an invasion only for land. And there is some evidence that the U.S. government knew this, that people look back today from even within the military and consider this war not our purest motives, although our troops fought very bravely and efficiently, that we may have pushed a little far and it had consequences. I think that when we come to a cemetery to meditate, to think, it's only right to let our minds think about all of the different points of views that make this cemetery, this place of peace, special. And that includes being willing to look at ourselves. Of course, it includes looking at ourselves and saying, did we act exactly how we wanted to? Although we were building a military at that time, our force was almost all voluntary. One thing that truly made our invasion that much more powerful is that we had created a system of pulling cannons by horse, creating a type of blitzkrieg in our battles that other armies had not realized at that time. The tactic was only about 30 years old. And this was the first war that it was experimented with, and it worked brilliantly. If you read U.S. soldiers' accounts, it should always be mentioned that although the Spanish military was not as organized, the soldiers themselves were incredibly brave. And I think that we should always pay tribute not only to the American troops, but to the Mexican troops who did fight for their country and did fight for liberty and did, in many people's opinion, they fought for what was legally truthful. You think about the soldiers at this time, the Irish, the Italians, the Germans, recent immigrants trying to create a new life, and sadly, many of them had to be buried here. But what they tried to accomplish, and what they did accomplish by creating a whole new country that was powerful, that was brilliant, that went from California to New York, we can talk honestly about if we agree or don't agree with that, and we should always highlight what Mexicans feel about this war. But for them, buried in that grave, the unknown soldier, It's amazing what they accomplished. It's amazing what they built, and it took their lives to do it. But it created a space, an identity in the United States for the immigrant. And on that level, we should also not take anything away from the beauty of that sacrifice. I believe that stands for American Battle Monument Commission. It would be fair to mention that the man who negotiated the peace treaty with the Mexican government, he was sitting at the area near the Basilica de Guadalupe, and the Mexican turned to him and he said, "You must be very proud." And in his memoirs, he did write that if the Mexicans could see into his heart, that he would see how much shame he had. I think that's fair to mention. I mean, no disrespect, but it's from his own account. Clearly, what he was talking about was how we were taking Texas to California, and possibly the motivation behind it, how we kind of set Mexico up. And I think that's fair to talk about. I think General Colin Powell once said that war can never be completely predictable, and I'm paraphrasing this. But once that you start the chaos of war, it's impossible to fully know which way it will break, one way or the other. And the United States really did almost lose this war, although we were incredibly powerful and decisive and won battle after battle. But there were small little decisions, attacking this hill or the other. In no way was Mexico hopeless. They had brilliant thinking as well, but things just broke left or to the right. When I walk through the cemetery, I think about a story that a soldier from the United States wrote during this war. He was in a battle, I believe it was in Satil. He was wounded and he was bleeding, laying on the ground. A Mexican woman ran out of her house. She took the bandana or the head wrap off of herself and she tied it around his wound and maybe saved his life. As she was doing that, as she finished it, he says he heard a couple of shots from somewhere, and she fell down next to him and died. And he said that if he was to describe war as anything, it would be that memory. That's what war is.